right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and greetings to the people in the Outreach Ministry. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, v'yahavto et Yahweh Elohecha, b'kol levaveka, uv'kol nafesheka, uv'kol ma'odeka. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is your Elohim, Yahweh is one, and you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your resources. I want to talk about the big picture today. Didn't there used to be a television program called The Big Picture? Anybody remember that? Louise, if there was such a thing, you'd remember that. Wasn't there or was it something that was put on at the beginning of the movies called a video about the big picture? Anybody remember that? Well, I'm having one of those moments again. I guess you could call that a senior moment. It was way back there. Anyway, I want to talk about the big picture today because I think sometimes we forget about the big picture. And we need to keep our focus on the big picture. I want to start out in Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 7. Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 7. And as far as the big picture is concerned, another title that we could give to the big picture is the eye of Yahweh. Where is Yahweh's eye?
On Jerusalem.
Whoa. Dan says on Jerusalem. Well, that's strange, isn't it? Because doesn't he say he's rejected Jerusalem? The eye of Yahweh. And there's a lot more to it than just where is his heart? Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 7. So I want to review this with you today. And it is pretty much review, but it's to try to get your focus. 2 weeks ago, I think it was. Was that 2 weeks ago when I went through the 28 prophecies of Yeshua's betrayal and death that appeared in the Old Testament? Wasn't that 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago? I think it's going to be the first DVD of this next set. But today I want to focus on the other part of that. Zechariah 2 and verse 7. O Zion. What is Zion? Well, it's pretty specific in Israel, though. It's a mountain in Israel, and it's just west and maybe slightly south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Zion. And actually, when Yahweh uses the term Zion, he really is talking about Jerusalem. But is he talking about the city with dusty streets, or muddy streets if it happens to be raining, or snowy and icy streets if it happens to be snowing? Is he talking about that, the condition of the physical land? Sometimes he's talking about the people. O Zion, escape, you who dwell with the daughter of Babel. For thus said Yahweh of hosts, for the sake of esteem he sent me to the Gentiles, which plunder you. So he's talking, did the Gentiles plunder Jerusalem? Yes, they did. And they certainly plundered the people. Okay? Then he says, quote, for he who touches you touches the apple of my eye. He who touches you touches the apple of my eye. So, could we think of on our dollar bill we have that all-seeing eye of supposedly God, on our dollar bill. And, the Masons, the ones who put that symbol on our dollar bill, have an idea about the all-seeing eye. But that's the focus of that eye. Where is that focus? Well, that focus is not in Jerusalem and not in that land. But can we find in Scripture, can we get this big picture in our minds of where is Yahweh's focus? There are two themes that run consistently throughout the Scriptures, and they are Israel and Israel's Messiah. 30% of Scripture is prophecy. Now, we are not going to understand 100% of prophecy, but we do have to focus on some prophecy in order to know where Yahweh's eye is, don't we? How much prophecy is there? Now, not that you've read it, but this is kind of a rhetorical question because I don't think anybody has read all these books. How much prophecy is there in the Quran? Do you ever see anybody emphasize the prophecy of the Quran? In the Book of Mormon, is there prophecy in the Book of Mormon? In the Hindu Vedas, those are the books that the Hindus go by, or the writings. The Bhagavad Gita, which you probably never heard of. The Ramayana. The sayings of Buddha or Confucius. How much prophecy is there in those writings? Much of the prophecy in the Scripture is about the Messiah. Just like a couple weeks ago, we went through the 28 areas of Scripture that emphasize the betrayal and the death, minutely, of Yeshua Messiah. Do you know there are no prophecies that foretold the coming of Buddha, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Confucius, Joseph Smith, Mary Baker Eddy, Ellen G. White, Hindu gurus? There are no prophecies in any of their writings, at least, that foretold those things. Now, we might find some prophecies in the Scriptures that hint at those false teachers coming up, mightn't we? But that'd be the only place. That would be the only place. Over 300 Old Testament prophecies identify Israel's Messiah, according to David Hunt. He took the time to count it. That's why I'm mentioning his name. He wrote the book, A Woman Rides the Beast. Over 300. And we only went through, about a little over 30. Because some of them were, some of the 28 were actually dual. There were a couple of places where they were mentioned. I want you to bear with me now as we go through some of the prophecies, not about that Messiah, but about Israel itself. The first major prophecy of note in the Scripture, of course, that has to do with Israel. The first major prophecy is Genesis 3:15, where the Messiah was promised. Okay? But the first major prophecy that has to do with Israel has to do with Yahweh promising a land. A land. Okay? Genesis 15, verse 18. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18. Yahweh is dealing with Avram, and he says this: on the same day, Yahweh made a covenant with Avram, saying, I have given this land. What was that land? Was that from, the Mississippi to the Atlantic coast? Or from the Mississippi to the Pacific coast? That land, it's a specific land. From the river of Mitzrayim to the great river, the river Euphrates. In verse 19, with the Canaanite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite. In verse 20, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim. In 21, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. He's pretty specific about that land, about what land that is. If you do not have in your focus, in your big picture of what Yahweh is doing on this earth, if you do not have a focus on that land, you're missing the boat. You're missing the boat. Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. Yahweh said to Avram, go yourself out of your land, that was a specific land, from your relatives, from your father's house, to a land which I show you. What land did he show him? There wasn't a mountain high enough in that area, in the Middle East over there. There wasn't a mountain high enough for him to be able to see this land. Now, I have no doubt that in the scattering of the people of Israel, there was a specific reason for that, which we should all very well understand, that Yahweh did bring his people here and cast them into this land. But his focus is not here on this land. How many prophets have there been who have come here to try to turn these lost tribes of Israel back to Yahweh? Anybody know of any? It certainly wasn't Joseph Smith. Not sent by Yahweh. But they haven't been here. They haven't been even sent to turn back to the land that Yahweh said was the land. And only Yahweh is going to do that. In Genesis chapter 13 and verse 14, after Lot had separated from Avram, Yahweh said to him, "Now, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which you see I shall give to you and to your seed forever." That tells you something about the focus of Yahweh. Where is Yahweh's eye? Where is his eye? I will give it to you forever. And it was pretty specific. Now, I presume, if I might conjecture, I presume that he was standing either on the Mount Moriah, or some mountain nearby, or maybe some mountain slightly east of that. But it was a pretty high place for him to be able to look out from that place and for Yahweh to say, "All the land that you see, I'm going to give it to you." But it was a very specific land. Very specific. And Yahweh's focus is there, right? Anybody see that differently? To your seed forever. Now, back in Genesis chapter 15, this time in verse 7, Genesis chapter 15, so you're pretty much in Genesis here, because, Genesis is the book of Yahweh's introduction. He's telling us what he's about. He's introducing himself to mankind. And there's no doubt that the plan that he set forth in Genesis chapter 126 is extremely important and is part of the big picture, but these scriptures show where his focus has always remained. Genesis 15:7, and he said to him, again he's talking to Yahweh is talking to Avram, and he said to him, "I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it." Did Yahweh ever change the land of the inheritance? I can't find any scripture that shows that Yahweh ever changed the land that he chose for the inheritance of Abram and his seed. Joshua chapter 14. Joshua 14. Now we're going to fill in that little space because we just jumped through Egypt all the way through to the Promised Land, okay? But it's to show you that Yahweh's focus always comes back to that land. Joshua 14 and verse 9. So Moses swore on that day, saying, "The land on which your foot has trodden is your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have followed Yahweh my Elohim completely." And I believe he's talking to Joshua. Because not all Israel did that, did they? Now, history proves that Yahweh brought this people out of Egypt into that promised land. Do we have any dispute with that? Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. Yahweh said, Exodus 3 and verse 7, Yahweh said, "I have indeed seen the oppression of my people who are in Mitzrayim." And again, in your focus and in your appreciation and understanding of the eye of Yahweh and where is Yahweh's focus, you go back to How did Israel get into Egypt? And of course it was a famine that brought them down there, and Yahweh sent Joseph ahead in a very unusual way to prepare a place for them. But this place for them is not far removed. It's within, not a day's journey, but several days' walking distance. That land of the inheritance, several days' walking distance from where he sheltered them through that famine. But Yahweh heard their oppression that they got into down there, and I have heard their cry, in verse 7, because of their slave drivers. For I know their sorrows, and I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Mitzrites, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And it didn't mean literally that there were so many cows that you milked them and the land was full of that milk, and there were so many bees that they made all kinds of honey. It's a statement of prosperity, flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Well, that's the land that he's going to take them to, and wasn't that the very land that he promised Abraham? And he hasn't changed his focus. Even if he removes those people from the land, which he said he would do, it's still the same land. It's still the promised land. So, Yahweh promised a land, a very specific land. Now, you will notice as we go through here, and maybe as you think about your dealings with the Scripture, your reading and studying in the Scripture, you ask yourself when in the course of human history, from the time that Yahweh began to deal with Avram and changed his name to Abraham, when in the course of all that history did Yahweh change the land of the inheritance? And if you can find those scriptures, I'd love to see them. Well, when he brought them into the land, number 2, when he brought them into the land that he promised them, he warned them not to fall into idolatry. Deuteronomy chapter 9. This is actually, a warning before they came into the land, but it was in anticipation of going into that land of the inheritance. Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 4. Do not think in your heart, after Yahweh your Elohim has driven them out before you. Remember those peoples, the ones we mentioned twice from the book of Genesis and Joshua. Saying, because of my righteousness, Yahweh has brought me in to possess this land. So Yahweh is pretty much telling them here, you're not going to earn the right to this inherited land. It's not because of your righteousness, but it is because of the wrong of these nations that Yahweh is driving them out before you. So they weren't going to earn the right to that inherited land. And then go to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15. Here is the chapter of the blessings and the cursings. Blessings if you obey and you have some righteousness. Cursings, which are going to come on you automatically if you do not obey. And he says in verse 15, Deuteronomy 28:15, and it shall be, if you do not obey the voice of Yahweh your Elohim, to guard to do all his commands and his laws, which I command you today. Remember that doing all that's not going to earn them the land of the inheritance, because that is never going to change. But if you do not obey, all of these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And skip all the way down to verse 63. And it shall be that as Yahweh rejoiced over you to do good and increase you, so Yahweh does rejoice over you to destroy you and to lay you waste. Not the land. The disobedient people. And you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. And so here, this is the consequence of disobedience. And one of the major disobediences occurred even before, they got to the land. One reason why they had to spend 40 years to get there, when it was really just a few days' walk. The idolatry, the golden calf, the clinging to the mighty ones that they should have left back in Egypt, that they shouldn't have been worshiping back there anyway. So he says, you will be plucked off the land which you go to possess. He doesn't curse the land. He never curses the land. We're going to see it, we're going to see that scripture that you quoted to me the other day at the end. Okay? 1 Kings chapter 9. 1 Kings chapter 9. 1 Kings chapter 9. Solomon builds Yahweh a dwelling place, a sanctuary, if you will, a separated place where Yahweh can be, where Yahweh can have a place of being special like He is. All right, and Yahweh says this to Solomon: if you at all turn back, or actually, I think he's talking to David, you or your sons, from following me, and do not guard my commands, my laws, which I have set before you, but shall go and serve other mighty ones. So here's that idolatry. And bow yourself to them. Then I shall cut off Israel from the face of the soil, which I have given them, and send them away from my presence, this house which I have set apart for separated for my name, and Israel shall be a proverb and a mockery among all the peoples. So, what's Yahweh going to do in this focus? His focus is on that inheritance that He promised Abraham. And He says, if you or your sons lead the people down this road of idolatry, I'm going to remove you from the land. But I'm not going to remove the land. I'm going to remove you from the land. But we're going to see other statements where He says, not forever. Not forever. Because Yahweh's focus remains on the apple of His eye, the land. Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 7. Well, let's go to 2 Chronicles first. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 19. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 19. Pretty much a reiteration and a parallel to 1 Kings 9, 6. If you turn away and forsake my laws and my commands, 2 Chronicles 7, 19, which I have set before you, and shall go and serve other mighty ones, and bow yourself to them, then I shall pluck them from my land. Notice he calls it my land, which I have given them, and this house, which I have set apart or have separated for my name, I shall cast out of my sight and make it to be a proverb and a mockery among all the peoples. Is the land a mockery? No. That house that was built by their hands that they defiled. And does anybody not know the story of Solomon and what Solomon put in that house? Besides building it for Yahweh, married 300 wives and 700 concubines, something of that nature. And many of those wives and concubines had foreign mighty ones, and he set up grottos in the house of Yahweh for those pagan mighty ones. That puts ice in your spine, doesn't it? And so Yahweh tells him what he was going to do. But Jeremiah 31. Now Jeremiah 31 and verse 7. Jeremiah 31 and verse 7. Notice again, it's from that house that was molded and shaped with human hands, and those human hands became defiled with idolatry. Either specifically idolatry or complicit with idolatry. Right? Okay. Jeremiah 31:7. For thus says Yahweh, sing with gladness for Yaakov. Now this is a prophecy written by, or worded by Jeremiah, long after Solomon committed his acts, and Yahweh put a curse on that house, not the land. He never curses the land. And shout among the chief of the nations. And he still says, sing with gladness for Yaakov. After Yaakov is removed. I mean, Yaakov, for the most part, is already removed from the land by Assyria. The Assyrians. And Yehuda is yet to be taken to Babylon. Cry out, give praise, and say, O Yahweh, save your people, the remnant of Israel. And that is not Judah, by the way. It's part of the remnant, but that's not the remnant. He's not just talking about Yehuda. The remnant of Israel. And that's the ones who are scattered among the nations. See, I am bringing them from the land of the north, and shall gather them from the ends of the earth, among them the blind and the lame, those with child and those in labor together, a great assembly, going where? Going where? Returning here. Where was Jeremiah? He was in Jerusalem. He was in the heart of Israel. Well, history shows that the consequences foretold to Israel did come to pass. The consequences of idolatry came to pass. And Israel went into captivity mainly because of idolatry, putting something before Yahweh. And Yehuda went into captivity, and then some were allowed to come back to preserve the lineage of David, so that line would never be lost, and there would always be the availability and the ability to put a king on a throne from that lineage. Now, as far as the other tribes are concerned, we have an idea that the scripture in Genesis 49 gives us an idea where they are, but we cannot be certain. And they have been mixed among the tribes of the earth, so the purity is not there. But it doesn't mean that Yahweh doesn't recognize them as Yaakov. Okay. Well, Yahweh said his people, number 3, would be scattered among all the peoples. Deuteronomy 28:64. We read Deuteronomy 28:63. Deuteronomy 28:64, and Yahweh shall scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve the mighty ones which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone, and steeple, and other symbols, crosses, other mighty ones, called by other names. God, Lord. Mighty ones who do not teach and do not hold Israel to the Torah. Right? That happened? And 1 Kings 9:6 again. We read it already, so if you will just permit me to review that. If you had all turned back, you or your sons, from following me, and do not guard my commands, my laws, which I have set before you, but shall go and serve other mighty ones, and bow yourselves to them, Remember what we read in Deuteronomy 28:64 was one of the curses for not following Yahweh. Then I shall cut off Israel from the face of the soil which I have given them, and send them away from my presence, this house which I have separated for my name. And actually, he's talking about the building there that Solomon built, but the house of Israel. He's also speaking of that, separated for his name, because that's the house of Israel. Israel was separated for his name. And Israel shall be a proverb and a mockery among all the peoples. Among all the peoples. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 8. Now, this is specifically talking about the Yahudim, because they were the ones who went into Babylon, and in Ezra and Nehemiah we see the decrees that allow them to come back and work on that house again, and work on that fortress, if you will, that was on the top of that mountain, Mount Moriah. Nehemiah 1 and verse 8. Please remember the word that you commanded your servant Moshe, saying, if you trespass, I shall scatter you among the peoples. So this is, the Yahudim are remembering that Yahweh said he would scatter even them among the people, because they took that as a command or a consequence for all Israel, including Yahudim, if they would turn away from Yahweh. Amos chapter 9 and verse 9. Amos chapter 9 and verse 9. For look, I am commanding, and I shall sift the house of Israel among all the Gentiles as one sifts with a sieve, yet not a, notice this, yet not a grain falls to the ground. So, yes, Yahweh says he's going to sift them, but as far as he is concerned, he knows where they are. When Yeshua says, I am not sent, but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, did he have to get a magnifying glass and a big spotlight to go search, or did he really know where they were? They were just cast out of the land. And the whole idea of the gospel, the Tov Basar, is to get them to turn back to Yahweh so they could go where? So they could go where? Back to the land. The land. Zechariah 7 and verse 14. Zechariah 7 and verse 14. And I scattered them with a storm wind among all the Gentiles which they had not known. And the land was laid waste. Well, it doesn't say the land is cursed. It's laid waste. And there's going to be a reason for that, which we're going to see in Leviticus 26 a little bit later. No one passing through or returning, for they made the pleasant land a waste. They made it a waste. Yahweh didn't make it a waste. They made it a waste. Because why? Because they disobeyed Yahweh. That was the reason it became a waste. Now, history shows that this happened, doesn't it? I mean, we know very well the history of the scattering of Israel, and that Israel, for the most part, all except the Yahudim, are pretty much unidentifiable to most people, and they don't even know they're Israel. But we see evidence on the History Channel every once in a while that there were Israelites here in this land. There are, the name Yahweh appears here and there, and there are some strange phenomenon that they identify as coming from ancient Israel. And very likely, even at the time of Solomon, there were ships that came over here and mined metals and took them back and aided in the building of the house for Yahweh. So history pretty much tells about that. So there are three major areas of prophecy: Yahweh promising a land, warning against idolatry, scattering, saying the consequences are going to be scattering his people. And then Yahweh told them, which we've already read and we're going to review it again, that they would be persecuted. That they would be persecuted. Now, they're not persecuted because they're following Yahweh. They're persecuted as a result of the curse of not following Yahweh. Deuteronomy 28 again. Deuteronomy 28. The blessings and the cursings. And remember, we're going to go down to verse 37, and after verse 15, we're in the curses. We're in the consequences for not obeying Yahweh. Primarily, the primary way that Israel did not obey Yahweh would all fall into the category of idolatry. Because if you put something ahead of Yahweh, I mean, yes, you can have wood, hay, or wooden metal, or stone, and you can bow down to it. But hey, we have stone in this land that people bow down to, and to them it doesn't have any religious significance. No, it's called skyscrapers. It's called halls of great financing, and so on and so forth, that people worship. So he says in verse 37, thus you shall, you fall into this, you shall become an astonishment, a proverb, and a mockery among all the peoples to which Yahweh drives you. Now, certainly that couldn't apply to the United States, could it? Because the whole world loves us. Am I living in a fantasy world when I say that? Yeah, pretty much. No matter how much aid we give to people, because we are not following Yahweh's way, we are still hated by all those people that we have doled out to try to pay for lovers. Right? 2 Chronicles, again, chapter 7. 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And all this is reminding you, we're trying to figure out, is Yahweh consistent on where his eye is? 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 20. Yahweh says, I shall pluck them from my land, which I have given them, and this house which I have separated for my name I shall cast out of my sight, and make it to be a proverb and a mockery among all the peoples. Among all the peoples. Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah 29 and verse 18, 19. Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 18. I shall pursue them with the sword, with scarcity of food, with pestilence. And I shall make them a horror among all the reigns of the earth. He's talking about Israel. To be a curse and an astonishment and a hissing and a reproach among all the Gentiles where I have driven them. For they did not heed my words, declares Yahweh, which I sent to them by my prophets, my servants, the prophets, rising early and sending them. Yet you did not listen, declares Yahweh. So it's not that Yahweh, just takes the people from the land and lets them scatter out, but he sends them prophets. And why would he have to send more prophets when all of these prophets carried that message that are in this book? This book that we as a people, whether we're Western Europe or whether we're the United States, have proliferated, have sent out, have published for hundreds of years, getting this book out and getting this message out with a false twist on it. But nonetheless, those prophets were there. They were in all of them, except those people who come down to this day and age and only use the red letter edition, the New Testament, But there it is. I sent my prophets. They were there. They were in their hand. They were put in their hand. Jeremiah 44. Jeremiah 44 and verse 7. And now, thus says Yahweh, the Elohim of hosts, the Elohim of Israel. Why are you doing this great evil against your lives? Why are you doing this? To cut off from you man and woman, child and infant from the midst of Yehudah, leaving none to remain, by provoking me with the works of your hands, by burning incense to other mighty ones in the land of Mitzrayim where you have gone to dwell, or wherever you've gone to dwell, to cut yourselves off and be a curse and a reproach among all the nations of the earth. So, does history show persecution for Israel and Yehudah? Did it come from Assyria? Did it come from Babylon? Did it come from Rome? Did it come from Germany? You know, once Constantine converted to Christianity, Christianity became the Hebrews' worst persecutors. And we have the history and the historical evidence of the Dark Ages and the pogroms, you know, that the Catholic Church perpetrated on what they called heretics. Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah chapter 30. But Yahweh declared, and so we've seen those things come to pass. I mean, it's pretty plain. But Yahweh declares that as bad as it would get, and as bad as Israel would get, he would not utterly destroy Israel. Of all the peoples on the earth, which peoples had the eye of Yahweh? Did Yahweh ever put his eye on a different people? I can't find it. Jeremiah 30 and verse 11. Jeremiah 30 and verse 11. Remember, Jeremiah is the one who says, if you don't turn back, and pleads with them to turn back. Of course, so did Isaiah. But he says, for I am with you, declares Yahweh, to save you. As bad as they get, Yahweh is there to save you. Though I make a complete end of all the Gentiles where I have scattered you, yet I do not make a complete end of you, but I shall reprove you in judgment and by no means leave you unpunished. But there's a promise from Yahweh, I will never make a complete end of you. And Jeremiah 31, and everybody should star this verse, write it in the front of your scripture so you know how to find it real quick, because it does come up every now and then. Jeremiah 31 and verse 35. Thus said Yahweh, who gives the sun for a light by day, and the laws of the moon and the stars for a light by night. Notice that the sun comes first again. And the laws of the moon and the stars for a light by night, who stirs up the sea and its waves roar. Yahweh Sabaoth of hosts is his name. If these laws, if the sun stops shining and if the moon goes cattywampus and no longer tells us when the months are, all of these things, all of those natural laws that Yahweh has put in motion, if these laws vanish from before me, declares Yahweh, then and only then will the seed of Israel cease from being a nation before me forever. That's pretty astounding. Thus said Yahweh, if the heavens above could be measured and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I would also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, because that's what they deserve. He didn't say that, but it's true, isn't it? But he says, no, bad as they are, I will not ever cast them away for all that they have done. He said they would be distinguished from all other people. Promised in Exodus chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33 and verse 16. Exodus 33 and verse 16. For how then shall it be known that I have found favor in your eyes? Eyes, there's the eye of Yahweh. I and your people, except you go with us. Moses is talking to Yahweh, to the Yahweh Yeshua. How will we know whether we are still the focus of your eyes unless you go with us? Then, if you go with us, then we shall be distinguished, I and your people, from all the people who are on the face of the earth. We shall be distinguished. Leviticus chapter 20. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 26. Leviticus 20:26. We might have read this last week. We're talking about Kodesh and separated. You shall be separated to me, for I, Yahweh, am separated, and have separated you from the peoples to be mine. That's a pretty special separation. And he would bring them back to the land that he promised them. Jeremiah 30 and verse 10. Jeremiah 30 and verse 10. We read verse 11. Jeremiah 30 and verse 10. And you do not fear, O Yaakov, my servant, declares Yahweh, nor be discouraged, O Israel. For look, I am saving you from afar, and your seed from the land of their captivity. And Yaakov shall return and have rest and be at ease with no one to trouble him. Return to what? To the land of inheritance. Next chapter, 31 and verse 8. Again, we read this already. See, I am bringing them from the land of the north, and shall gather them from the ends of the earth, among them the blind and the lame, those with child, those in labor, together a great assembly, returning here. With weeping they shall come, and with their prayers I bring them. I shall make them walk by rivers of waters in a straight way, in which they do not stumble. For I shall be a father to Israel and Ephraim. He is my firstborn. Hear the word of Yahweh, O Gentiles, and declared in the isles afar off. He who scattered Israel gathers him, and shall guard him as a shepherd his flock. For Yahweh shall ransom Yaakov and redeem him from the hand of one stronger than he. Not that is stronger than Israel, not stronger than Yahweh. And they shall come in and sing where? On the height of Zion. I told you where Zion is. I'm sure, Doris, you probably stood. Did they identify where Zion was when you were there? Now, see, I don't know if having been there helps to keep that focus, but I see people who have not been there who still have that focus in their heart. So somehow you got it. You got it. But I'll tell you what, it'll be stronger if you ever set foot there. It is the land that Yahweh has his eye focused on. It is. Where in Scripture do you find any prophecy about the Mississippi River? About the Ohio River? About the Great Plains of the United States? Or the wonderful mountains, the mountains' majesty that we sing about in some of our songs. You do not find anywhere in the Scripture that Yahweh has his focus anywhere but on that land, that is the land of the inheritance promised to Abraham. And if we're going to keep our minds on the big picture, we got to realize That's where Yahweh's focus is. He's not happy with what things are happening there even now, any more than he is anywhere else on the face of the earth right now. But when it all comes tumbling down, where are all the prophecies focused? Where are the two witnesses witnessing? Where is Yahweh's eye? On the height of Mount Zion, that's where they're going to come in and sing, and stream to the goodness of Yahweh for grain and new wine, for oil, for the young of the flock and the herd, and their being shall be like a well-watered garden and never languish again. Ezekiel 36. Ezekiel 36 and 20, beginning in verse 24. Ezekiel 36. What's happening in Ezekiel? It's talking about the millennium, isn't it? Ezekiel 36:24, and I shall take you from among the Gentiles, and I shall gather you out of all the lands, and I shall bring you into your own land. This strip of land in Florida is not it. It's not anywhere between the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's not anywhere between the Atlantic and the Pacific and the North and the South Pole. It isn't here. It's only that one land where Yahweh's eye is. In verse 35, same chapter, 36, Ezekiel, and they shall say, this land that was laid waste has become like a Garden of Eden. And already some are saying that because the land is a lot less wasted now than it was in 1948. It's still not all the way there yet. And the wasted, the deserted, and the destroyed cities are now walled and inhabited. And that's not true of all of them. Then the Gentiles which are left all around you shall know that I, Yahweh, have rebuilt the destroyed places and planted what was laid waste. I, Yahweh, have spoken it, and I shall do it. Thus said the Master Yahweh, once again I shall let the house of Israel inquire of me to do for them. I shall increase their men like a flock, as a separated flock, as the flock at Jerusalem, and her appointed times. So shall the wasted cities be filled with flocks of men, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. You can't know Yahweh if you don't know where his focus is. You know some things about him, but you can't really know Yahweh if you don't know where his eye is. Leviticus 26:42. Leviticus 26:42. Yahweh says, then I shall remember my covenant with Yaakov, and also my covenant with Yitzhak, and also remember my covenant with Abraham, and remember the land. Remember the land. Does that mean he forgot it? Or does that just mean that he's going to restore the promised land to the people to whom it was promised? For the land was abandoned by them. It has never been abandoned by Yahweh. It was abandoned by them and enjoying its Sabbaths while lying waste without them. Yahweh took the disobedient away from it so could enjoy the Sabbaths that it wasn't enjoying with them there because they were not obeying Torah. And they were paying for their crookedness because they rejected my right rulings and because their being loathed my laws. And yet for all this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I shall not reject them, nor shall I loathe them so as to destroy them and break my covenant with them, for I am Yahweh, their Elohim. And after 25 years, Yahweh will restore to them the land, the specific land that is the inheritance of Abraham. In the last days, Jerusalem will be a cup of, the ISR I think says astonishment. The King James says trembling. Zechariah 12 and verse 2. Zechariah 12 and verse 2. Where in the scriptures does it say in the latter days Washington, D.C. is going to be a trembling or an astonishment? Or New York City? Or Los Angeles? Or Kansas City or Minneapolis? Or Atlanta or New Orleans? Or St. Louis? Where is that in the scripture? I don't see it. Because Yahweh's eye is not here. This is not where his focus. Are things going to happen here? Oh yeah, to be sure. But for what purpose? To bring everything into focus of that land. Zechariah 12:2. See, I am making Jerusalem a cup of reeling to all people all around, and also against Yehuda it is in the siege against Jerusalem. And Yehuda is in the siege. And in that day, in verse 3, it shall be that I make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. Now, if he had cast it off, why would he care? You know, he cares, and he's going to make the burden of Jerusalem in the end time a stone, heavy stone for all peoples. All lifting it are severely injured, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered against it. To be sure, are there going to be nations probably gathered against Washington, D.C.? We can foresee that. Or against against Los Angeles or many other. I mean, there are probably plans being made. We had big attacks on New York. Right? It's true. But they're not in the scripture. The one that's in the scripture is Jerusalem. That's where Yahweh's eye is. That's where Yahweh's focus is, in that land. All the nations of the earth shall be gathered against it. 2,500 years ago, Jerusalem was in ruins. And all of this foretold 2,500 years ago, coming to pass, or will come to pass before some of our very eyes. Where was the eye of Yahweh focused? Where is the eye of Yahweh still focused? Let's close in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8. 32, Deuteronomy, and verse 8. I don't think you've got that in your notes. Deuteronomy 32. I better turn there so that I can... Oh, boy, I just turned right to it. Huh? Oh, is it in the notes? Oh, okay. I guess maybe that Leviticus 26 one wasn't in the notes. I know there was one scripture that I was going to cover that wasn't in the notes. Okay, Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, that word inheritance pretty important to Yahweh, isn't it? When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. For the portion of Yahweh, in verse 9, is his people. Yahweh, his allotted inheritance. Yaakov, his allotted inheritance. He found him in a wilderness and in a wasted, howling desert. He encompassed him. He made him understand. He watched over him as the apple of his eye. May Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and give you favor. May Yahweh lift up his countenance over you and give you his peace. Yivarekecha Yahweh va'ishmerecha. Ya'er Yahweh panavaleka v'kaneka. Yasa Yahweh panavaleka v'yasem l'ka shalom.